I'm Dr. Brian Jenkins. This is Theology Threads, and we're going to be looking at one of the most esoteric and obscure books of the Bible. As short as it is, it's had a lasting impact on Christian faith. So we're going to be talking about the Beatles, we're going to be talking about Hey Jude, we're going to be talking about Enoch, we're going to be talking about Nephilim, we're going to be talking about Timothy Zahn and Heir to the Empire from the Star Wars Legends series. It's going to be amazing. You're going to want to stick around and find out. Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to Theology Threads. Hopefully you enjoyed our previous sessions dealing with the letter of 1 Peter. Now, it may make some level of common sense to say, well, let's jump into 2 Peter, but we're actually not going to do that. We are going to go into one very short book. It's probably the shortest book in the New, well, it's not the shortest book in the New Testament, but it's only like 25 verses, and it is the book or the letter or the sermon speech of Jude. Why is this book important? Why should we stop and pay attention to it? Well, commentator Richard Bauckham says that it could easily be among the earliest of the New Testament documents, as well as being rare and valuable firsthand evidence of the character of Christian devotion and developing theology of those original Palestinian circles in which Jesus' own relatives were leaders. In other words, the reason we want to stop and take a look at this pretty unique and fascinating, little series of verses is because of its, for lack of a better term, its primitive nature. It is very early on, and it is very primitive. And so what you see are the first wrestlings and the first development of theological constructs that will then produce some of the other great books of the New Testament. Where does Paul get his great ideas about Jesus from? Where does John get his great ideas about Jesus from? Where does even Peter or Luke or anyone, as they begin to establish Christological and theological development, because it becomes very advanced the later you move into the New Testament on a timeline point of view, where did all that start? And Jude is one of those examples, along with the book of James and along perhaps with even 1 Peter. They show us the very beginnings of some of this development, the first attempts to develop Christianity and take the teachings of Christ and begin to flesh them out and expand them. Why? Well, we'll get into that. Let's talk a little bit about who the Jude that we're talking about is. Jude was, fortunately/unfortunately, an incredibly popular name in the ancient world, especially in ancient Israel. Why? Because it was the name of Judah, one of the founders of the 12 tribes of Israel. It was the name of the region of Israel that survived for a long time. The Roman occupation called this part of the world Judea, Idumea. They called it this. It was just a great name to identify with, and it has forms. You have people being named Jude, you have people being named Judah, you have people being named Judas, you have people being named Judea, and it could have been all sorts of names for all sorts of people. So we have to look and say, okay, well, when it is such a common name, is there anything that helps us identify who it may have been? And right off the bat, the author of Jude says, Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ and a brother of James. So now we have at least two names. So think of it almost as like GPS triangulation. So we have three names that bring each other within proximity: Jude, Jesus, and James. Well, we know that there is a James who is in very close proximity with Jesus, and that was Jesus's half-brother, James, the first bishop of Jerusalem, the first leader of the early church, the first sort of head of, he led the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, and more than likely authored the letter of James. So we have James, who we know is the brother, and I say half-brother because they had same mom, different dads. He is the biological brother of Jesus himself. And then, so now we have Jude saying, I am a servant of Jesus, but I am a brother of James. So in the ancient world, you'd only mention somebody's name if most people would have known who they were. So we can take a relative confidence in establishing that this James is the same James that wrote the epistle of James, and therefore is the James, the brother of Jesus from Acts 15. Therefore, Jude, we can make I think a well-educated guess. It is an assumption, it is speculation, and I want to stop and say it's okay for us to admit that. Who he is in terms of his identity is important, and it's critical, and it helps establish the apostolic nature, but it's not entirely dependent on his apostolic authority, or his apostolic authority is not entirely dependent on that, but it is critical. So it's important to try to establish it, but it's just a great exercise to give us context and to give us understanding. So who do we think Jude could have been? Well, there's three sort of big possibilities. One was the apostle who was named Jude. One, not Judas, he was obviously on the outs at that point, but one of the apostles was named Jude. We know that there was the third bishop of Jerusalem was someone named Jude, and then we have Jude, who we do know was one of the brothers of Jesus. So when you take those three and you sort of put them all together, it's a pretty good likely scenario that it's going to be Jude, the brother of Jesus. There's also some more ancient there's a later commentary that says that Jude was one of the names, was Thomas's real name, because Thomas in the Bible is not his name, it's a nickname. It's because he was called the twin. And so some people think this may be Jude who was called Thomas, and that he may have written this, but that's really just more Eastern speculation, and there's not a lot of scholarship that's going to support that much longer. So for the sake of our discussion over the next couple of episodes, we're going to go with this is Jude, half-brother of Jesus. Why is that important? Well, number one, Jude did not believe in Jesus before the resurrection. We know that from John chapter 7, verses 1 through 9. They all thought he was crazy. They thought he was nuts. But something, because of the resurrection and because of the crucifixion and the resurrection, compelled them so much that they then chose to follow their brother, James and Jude, and follow him into that apostolic church leadership authority. He writes with a deep heart and a deep love for his readers, but he is incredibly firm and very stern with them, which is also in a lot of ways the same personality as James. James tends to be very direct, very to the point. Jude is also very direct and very to the point. And you can't help but wonder if maybe that was their father, Joseph's personality. They share a personality in their writings in some way. He also writes in a very natural style. He draws allusions to nature, and he actually writes pretty good. His Greek is very good, and his imagery is very beautiful. It's very descriptive and very depth, which James also does. We know there's a lot of natural imagery in the book of James, and we know that Jesus himself used a lot of imagery from the natural world to teach. So there is at least a common culture around their teaching. Loving, gentle, but very direct, very to the point to the people that he cares about. And as with Jesus, as with James, Jude is very intense and incredibly pointed to his opponents. Which leads us to kind of the next question, who is he writing to and who is he talking about? So let's talk about the book a little bit. First off, we have to understand that the original recipients of the letter, we don't know who they are. There is no to. It just says, I'm writing. So the introduction just gives his name, and all it says is to those who are called. That's it. So that could mean the church. It could be those who are chosen, those who are elect, which could mean Christian Messianic, or what we call Hebraic or Jewish Christians, ethnically Jewish Christians. So there's all this sort of stuff that says, well, we don't know exactly who. So we have to go into the letter to look at that. And there is a sense, and we'll see it as we get into, like I said, in these next couple of episodes, as we get into it and we look at the verses sort of verse by verse. But just like James, Jude feels very Jewish. And what I mean by that is its primitive nature, it's written very early on, and really you got to remember, the earliest Christians were Jewish. So what can we surmise? That more than likely, This is written to Jews living in Judea. Some commentators even go as far as to say they would have lived in those areas west of the Jordan River. So what we would now call Palestinian Jews, that sort of region, very specifically in that area. So we're going to go with Christian Jews living in Judea, which the Romans would later rename into Palestine. And so that's what we're going to go with. So it's written to the people around him. It's written to people he cares about. It's written to people of his own ethnic persuasion, his own religious background. Okay. Why is he writing it? Well, he's writing it like most letters or most sermons or most speeches were written in the New Testament. He actually says in the first few verses, I really just wanted to write you to give you an update and say hi. He says, I was just eager to write to you about our common salvation. Like, I just wanted to check in and share some theology with you. But as with most letters or most of these epistles in the New Testament, he has a problem to deal with. And that problem is false teaching. The problem is some sort of heresy is beginning to bubble up within these early Christians that he feels the need to challenge, to push back on. And that's really what the heart of the sermon letter is that he is taking time to refute the character, specifically the character of the people saying these heretical things. He actually doesn't spend a lot of time disputing the heresy that was popping up itself. He's disputing the character. And so that could feel like, if you are on the internet or if you're on Reddit or you're on anything where people are debating with each other, an ad hominem attack. In other words, I'm not attacking the validity of what you're saying, I'm attacking the quality of you as a person. But in the ancient world, that's kind of what you did. The quality, the moral life, or the effects of someone's teaching on their life was a way to either validate or refute the teachings to begin with. So essentially, Jude's approach is to say, you're teaching these things and they aren't even working for you. They're not making you like Jesus. They're not making you form into the character of Christ. They're making you immoral, evil, wicked, debaucherous, impure people. Therefore, the teachings themselves must be flawed. So it's a way of looking, sort of reverse engineering approach. I'm going to look at your actual lifestyle, and then that gives me the opportunity in the ancient world. If I looked at your life and say, it's not even working for you, you can't even live this, why should I? And so that's how he begins to address them. The date is also relatively uncertain. It can go anywhere from, as with anything, it can go anywhere from 40s all the way up to the 80s. What we're looking at probably for this is a timeline somewhere in the mid 50s to at the very earliest, the first year or two of the 60s. It wouldn't go much farther than that, because then you're getting Paul is full steam at that point. Peter is full steam at that point. Persecutions are starting to set in. There's not a lot of that in this letter. So really, it's probably earlier, because it's giving a chance to say, hey, let's talk about these things at a theological level. We know, obviously, very early on, that theological issues started to pop up. Even in the book of Acts, we can see the theological struggles. We see the theological struggles with the Judaizers or the party of the circumcision. We see theological struggles with people like Simon Magus, who want to bring in sort of this blended idea of how can I bring the sorcery of the pagan world into the belief of Christianity. We see these adoptions and appropriations of the Christian testimony, and they're having to deal with it very early. So Jude steps right into that. And he's stepping into some sort of heresy that seems to deal with the nature of Jesus and therefore the morality of my life. Really, what he is writing is to warning against any teacher that's going to sort of deny the lordship of Christ or deny the deity of the lordship of Christ, to encourage people. You had teachers that were already encouraging people to be in their flesh, as we would say, follow their lustful, natural, uninhibited, and unrestrained desires, rejecting the authority of the apostolate, right? So they were already beginning to push back against leaders and God's intended leaders. So he's going to talk about that. He's going to talk about just the unhealthy and unpleasant nature of being divisive in general, being a problem within the church in general, and then ultimately selfish living, which is sort of the pinnacle of all of that. So what he's doing is those are him speaking to his opponents, to his readers, to the people that he's trying to encourage them. He wants them to contend for the faith. He makes it very clear in the first several verses. I'm here to get you to fight for the faith, contend for the faith. Not angrily, not violently, but vigilantly. Pay attention to what you're learning and what's being taught. As Christianity was beginning to spread and as influences, because it's so culturally expansive, those cultural influences are starting to spread into it. So that's why we have so many of these New Testament authors saying, pay attention to what's coming out of you and pay attention to what's coming into you theologically. We still have to contend for that faith today. We have to be careful. We always have to be aware of, as the Christian gospel expands and goes forward and begins to seep into a culture, is that culture then seeping back in to Christianity? Are there things from our culture, whether it's our greed, our selfishness, our spiritual distraction, our need for formulas and talismans and magic spells, all that, does that reverse engineer and find its way back into Christianity? We have to always be very, very careful of those things. If the people that literally could remember, that were in living memory of hearing Jesus teaching, had to stay vigilant, how much more do we need to stay vigilant? It is an intense letter, and we're probably all very lucky that it's not any longer than the handful of verses that it is, because it's very intense and it's very to the point, and there's a refreshingness to that. I think that will translate very well in our discussions over the next couple of episodes. I think you're going to enjoy it, but it's very intense and it's very to the point, but it ends with actually one of my all-time favorite verses. So make sure that you've liked and you've subscribed and you've done all the things, you've hit the notification bell so that you're not missing any of these episodes, that you're sharing it with friends, so that you can get all of this, because one of my absolute favorite verses in the Bible is going to be coming up. One other thing too, there's a couple of then just generally interesting things about Jude. One is its rhetorical style. It doesn't feel like a letter. In fact, a lot of people think that its original composition, the original state of it, was that it was not a letter. It was probably a speech or a sermon that then Jude turned into a letter. It really follows a very specific rhetorical flow from the ancient world. It's a very specific pattern, and it follows it almost to the T. The only things that make it deviate from a rhetorical speech of the ancient world are the things that make it feel like a letter. So it's very natural to say, this was written first, and then he said, I need to send this out, so I'll just add my greeting and my doxology or my prayer at the end. So you can imagine he wrote one first and then added the other two at the end. And then he begins to send it out and it gets read. The other thing is that it is probably meant, rather than just to be read, it is probably meant, at least in Greek, to be read out loud. It was intended as I don't want to say performative, but for lack of a word, it is intended to be experienced. It's intended to be heard, not just read. And so it's going to come off that way. We're not going to read it in Greek because that would offend everybody, even people who've been dead for 20 centuries. But it really comes off really cool and very, very well. So it's fascinating in that respect. The other thing that Jude is probably the most known for, other than being super short. It is interesting though, before I get into that, it's interesting because some of the commentators point out that it's one of the most ignored letters or works of the New Testament. You don't hear a lot of it. Part of it's because it's so short. You can read it in about 7 or 8 minutes. I mean, you can read it pretty quick. It doesn't really get the praise that it deserves. This is so early on that there's not a lot else to talk about. He's not talking about a lot of division. He's not talking about cultural interaction. He is just simply talking about there's a weird teaching that's come among you. these are the people who really, if you pay attention to the lives of the people who follow this teaching, it's incredibly ungodly. And if you follow it, you're going to wind up the same way. You're going to be on the outside looking in. So be very careful of that and make sure you're really loving each other in that process. So that's kind of really the massively big picture of it. But what Jude is probably most famous for is its use of non-canonical Jewish literature. Okay, so there is this bulk of Jewish literature called, some of it's called the Apocrypha, other it's just was found. They found it when they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran. So it's all of this extra biblical or non-biblical writings that were just culturally around, right? And so people are always super, super fascinated by them. And it was really people using the cultural milieus of their day to try and make more of the Bible than what they had been given. And you say, well, is it inspired? Is it not inspired? Those are all the discussions we're going to have when we get to these verses in Jude. But how do we perceive those? So one of the best ways that I can describe it is there are a handful of books in modern Christian literature that are so powerful and so prominent that they actually affect the way that we interpret things on the everyday. They are not the Bible, and yet they became so influential that they really are almost biblical in their level of influence in how we interpret other biblical passages. So one of them was a book in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. And it was a book on the study of the book of Revelation. It was a study of the book of Revelation and the prophecies concerning the end times. So much of its content became so powerful that people assume that's exactly what the Bible is saying. So things like, I think of this great movie from the 70s called, it was A Thief in the Night, right? So there's this trilogy of apocalypse movies called A Thief in the Night. And so it's things like people being beheaded by a guillotine. Well, do we know that people may be beheaded in the apocalypse or in the tribulation because of their willingness to continue to follow Christ? Probably, but John had never seen a guillotine. That was invented by the French. So we know that he probably didn't see that. The idea that specific things that John saw in the book of Revelation were things like helicopters and nuclear missiles. All of that just came about because of Hal Lindsey and then Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins writing the Left Behind books. So they take these ideas and they turn them into pseudo-fact. Another great example would be the impact of the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis on how we see spiritual warfare. So nothing about the Screwtape, as much as I love C.S. Lewis, the Screwtape Letters are not the Bible. They're just a really brilliant, creative guy imagining what would it be like if a senior demon was writing his protege demon, his demon Padawan, if he was writing him a letter. That's all that it is. But it's so believable and it's so inspired and it's so creative. People have actually gone on to think that's how it actually works. The final one would be books, shout out to Pacific Northwest guy, called This Present Darkness and Piercing the Darkness by Frank Peretti. They're incredibly vivid images on how spiritual warfare could potentially work. So much that people assume that's how it actually works. It's not a great analogy, but it's somewhat similar. That there is a series of books written in between the closing of the New Testament and the opening of the New Testament that were so profound and so creative and so culturally influential that they even left an imprint on Christianity. Not because of their inspiration, but because of their cultural impact and influence. And as Christianity was speaking to different cultures and speaking to different influences, it addressed and appropriates these works of literature as a way to communicate Christian truth. That's where the book of Enoch comes in. So I made a joke that if you say Enoch enough times on YouTube, your views go up. But Enoch is so fascinating and it's so interesting. Why? Because it is a non-biblical, non-canonical, by every impression, expansion of a handful of verses in Genesis, some in Zechariah. That's all that's being done there. And so whoever wrote this said, wow, these verses are interesting. I want to make more of them that's there. But yet it left an impression on people that it was seen as though it were as good as true. Maybe that's a good way. It's such a great description. It's such a great understanding of it. Maybe it's the same way. It's the same way people use Paradise Lost by John Milton as a way to explain the workings of the devil. It's the same way that people use Dante's Inferno to give an image of hell. It's exactly the same. Non-biblical, non-canonical, non-inspired, but so culturally influential that anyone trying to speak to a culture has to pay attention to it. The other is a text called The Assumption of Moses, which was a story about what happens to Moses' body after he died. So Jude actually, like Peter sort of referenced them, if you go back a few episodes, Jude straight up talks about him. And it creates all of these wonderful questions that we'll deal with when we get to those verses. But that's one of the reasons people find it both fascinating, but that's one of the reasons people don't teach on it a lot, because they just don't know what to do with those verses. Well, friends, I know. I'm just kidding. That was way more, I'm joking. I don't know either. But we're going to have fun looking at those verses and telling you the story. So guys, we're going to talk about Nephilim. We're going to talk about the Watchers. We're going to talk about giants. We're going to talk about Michael and Satan fighting over the body of Moses. We're going to talk about it all. So make sure that you're subscribed. Make sure you're followed. Make sure you're getting the notifications, because we're going to kind of get into some of the extra stuff, right? If we're talking canon, we're going to get into Legends territory. We'll be pulling out some Grand Admiral Thrawn level stuff here, which is a very specific reference. Heir to the Empire. That's the level that we're going to be dealing with. So I think we're going to have a great time. I think you're going to enjoy it. We're going to walk through Jude, maybe take 2, maybe 3 episodes max. I really don't know yet. I really want to make sure that we have a really good, healthy, theologically robust discussion about those extra biblical passages that find their way into the Bible and what to do with them. But I think you're going to enjoy it. So make sure that you like, click, subscribe, hang around with us. We're going to have a great time. And man, I can't wait to see you next time.